The Hulk's Scream. In the depths of the Underhive, the day started just like countless ones before it, for most citizens. The Black Magpie gang had been planning for months for this day. A cargo hauler was scheduled to arrive on Dove Hive loaded with spare pieces of machine parts to supply the field repairs of some Skitarii Legion. The hauler would be unloaded on the Hive and the cargo would be transferred to a warp-capable vessel which would travel to the system's Mandeville point and jump into the warp from there. The cargo would be in a low-security hangar for 2 hours during the initial unloading. This was going to give the Magpies just enough time to steal a crate of high-density hyperweave cloth. This daring heist was going to give the Magpies something to stand out above the rest of the other gangs. It would allow them to repair an ancient Archaeoraptor they had found and abandoned in the jungles outside of the Hive's Pearl, and with it, they would be able to go from a minor gang in Hab Block 561 to a planet-wide smuggling operation. The Spider was at the center of his net of stolen communicators, bypassed the Voxcaster receiver feeds and listening devices spread throughout the Hive Evolve. He took pride in being able to know if anything worth stealing was going to be an easy mark for his gang, and because of his ability, he had earned a comfortable position within the Black Magpies. He was able to sit at the center of his web on Hab Block 561 and have others take care of his food and protection requirements. On this day, however, the broad net the Spider had at his fingertips was not involved in the message he received. It started with a scream that could be heard throughout the whole Hive on Evier Quintus, as it was originating from within the heads of each of its inhabitants, or more accurately, it was originating from the telepathic projection of the Astropathic Choir at the Hive. The Astropathic Choir, who was responsible for maintaining the communication with the Imperium at large, the Astropathic Choir that could send and receive messages across the vastness of space, they were screaming! At first, the screams were those of a surprised pain, but they morphed into the cries of a man buried alive, of a man whose hands were full of separating sores from which maggots emerged, the scream of terror of a mind overwhelmed by the permanence of death and the inevitability of one's own body rotting until there was nothing left. The scream carried on for 3 agonizing hours until the astropaths, one by one, like candles in a furnace, burned themselves out from the sheer intensity of the experience. The Spider had passed out. Many an auscultator's servitor seemed to have been overwhelmed and perished. Whatever had just happened, it was going to make a lot of people panic and act stupidly. It was obvious that something had happened to the Astropathic Choir on Aviera Quintus. On principle, unrest in the Imperial government was good business for the gangs and the Underhive. On this instance, however, something worse seemed to be brewing. Small-scale chaos was good for business too, but too much could mean planetary collapse. Finally, on Com Channel 79, the Spider was able to get a sense of the outer world. It was a tight beam receiver that received system-wide communications.
Then we are agreed, Your Highness. Ships will be sent to counter the threat presented by this Space Hulk. You are now under our protection. You are one of us, and we will bleed for you and yours if it comes to it. We will join our efforts towards the greater good.
The voice had a foreign ring to it, and the Spider had never heard that before. The comm channel went dead after that. The message was over. Well, someone was out there, help was on its way, but the message hadn't ended with the customary, "May the Emperor's light illuminate your path." Was it a rogue trader that had extorted the planetary governor for protection? A pirate, maybe, taking advantage of the delicate situation? Well, the Spider didn't know. The Spider kept searching his web for more data, information, leverage. Eventually, a display flickered and lit up. It showed the holographic rendering of all vessels in system. A monstrously large thing was clear as day at the Mandeville point, almost as big as a moon. Its shape abhorrent wrong, made of the bulging hulls of ships too many to count. In the holographic display, the identification of 3 of them still appeared within the Hulk. The Castigator was somewhere at the front of the vessel, a signal identified as the personal transport Brilliant Soul was behind the Castigator, and the last identifying signal hailing from that Hulk was damaged. Every time the beacon sent out the name of the ship, the letters just flickered on and off. It almost looked like there was a coded message being sent out. Then the flickering stopped, and the only letters still transmitted were D, E, A, T, and H. With each pulse of the beacon, the flickering lasted a different amount of time, but the same letters were transmitted at the end. A bad omen brought on by servitor decay? Maybe? After over 5 hours of working in the dank darkness of the Underhive, the Spider had its web under control again. A bigger holographic display had been brought into the heart of the web to display the position of the vessels in the system. The spider kept flicking through the hive's Vox channels and relaying the information to the black magpies, who had gathered on the outside of his chamber, both awaiting news of the Archaeoraptor materials heist and whatever news there were of any easy marks after what was now apparent had been a planet-wide loss of consciousness. Some less fortunate souls had not awoken from the scream yet, and they would not be doing so ever again, as brain matter had been leaking from their ears. The inside of their heads turned to soup. It indeed was a field day for the gangs. With planetary defense overwhelmed and stretched thin, the Hyperweave Claws heist would go even easier than initially expected. Vox Channel 79 came back online with a crackle of static. Only the incoming channel could be heard, so the spider needed to wait for whatever the governor was beaming into space to end to hear the response.
Agreed. The vessel has not defended itself. It appears that it has no offensive projectile capabilities. Only the human auxiliaries who have manned the comms panels have been disturbed by its presence, and they have been placed far from the action. We recommend everyone under your command refrain from listening in to anything that is beamed out from that ship. Our guns have succeeded in piercing the vessel and tearing out a piece of the aft structure. We will deploy gravitic tugs and draw the larger body of the Hulk into the sun. We will lose those tugs, but the larger danger will be removed.
This voice had been harsher. It sounded military, but it made allusions to not being human itself. Who could they be, as they obviously weren't part of the Imperial Navy? What type of Xenos were these that were willing to sacrifice their ships by sending them into the sun for the safety of our Imperial system? The incoming feed started again.
It is beyond the scope of our abilities, sir. We currently have no more unengaged gravitic tugs in system, and any replacements would not arrive in time. I know you don't trust us. You think us Xenos and enemies of humanity. I will not mock you by requesting you evacuate the threatened area preemptively. Yet I must implore you listen to all reports available to one in your station, and you listen to the trader whose tight beam communique involved us in this crisis.
Static crackled. The governor must be beaming a message up to the Xenos. Xenos! So that is what was now in the system. Emperor grant us deliverance. Xenos protecting us from the Space Hulk? That had just come out of the warp? Why would the governor trust them? Intriguing, but not the spider's job. He kept the audio feed on, static crackling during the governor's monologue. So, a trader had hailed the Xenos and invited them into Imperial space. The idiotic trader would be in a black cell or something. Maybe even being recycled into mushroom food already. A quick search through the still functioning sensor channels found no trace of the rogue trader, but the Oculus servitors in the black cell vents had gone offline. General comm channels hive-wide had already started to call the event that had destroyed the astropathic choir the Shriek. The Shriek, then, had costed a serious amount of man-hours to the Black Magpies. It would take them many weeks of careful inching forward during the 5 minutes a day that the movement sensors in those vents were offline, for maintenance to slowly crawl to the Oculus servitor and plug the web into the replacement that should be fitted by the end of the day to replace the malfunctioning one. The Adeptus Arbites always replaced damaged sensors, but they had yet to realize that they weren't the only ones who could use them. He didn't envy the poor ratling who would be given the job to crawl in those vents. One twitch at the wrong time and they might well be turned into one of the servitors that would one day be added to his web. The spider was almost startled when the static suddenly stopped and was replaced with the incoming audio feed. It was still that low, emotionless voice. It understood emotions, but not how to express them in low Gothic.
All civilians should be evacuated, sir. Casualties will be horrific. Think of your people. Do what is best for them and keep your ego out of it.
The spider skidded out of his nest and looked at the holographic display. The signal from the castigator had gone out. The brilliant soul was still transmitting strong, and the damaged one had shifted the characters that still persevered to E, N, D, U, R, and E. Radiometric data showed now the rough outline of the Hulk, flanked and led by at least a dozen of smoothed circular ships. They were clearly headed for the start of the aviary system. They were already inside the orbit of Aviary Secundus. Good. Now, even if the Hulk split like an overripe fruit, the debris could only reach Aviary Primus. It would be a small price to pay. The planet was only of use as a Mechanicus Manufactorum tasked with creating Valve 3 of the Acatram pattern flamer. It housed just under 200,000 souls, The holographic display also showed other vessels in the system, much larger than the tugs but smaller than the Hulk by orders of magnitude still. The Spider went back to his comms panel. The Hulk would not be crashing into Aviary Quintus, so he didn't need to evacuate the planet. The population of the Dove Hive, however, would not be made aware of any news until the sanctioned and heavily doctored bulletin would be posted at the end of the week. The comms channels showed the frantic panic of every citizen in the hive, like maggots squirming in dead flesh when a vulture arrived. The Underhivers were more organized. There were bodies in the streets, of course, but the Underhive thrived on chaos. It was taking longer for the Upper Hive members to recover from the shock. That was good. The crew sent to steal the components needed for repairing the damaged Archaeoraptor hadn't reported in yet, but from what the Spider could gather, they were already in possession of the crates. An internal Arbites report had gone out alerting Sector 5 security that someone had murdered 2 warehouse guards and that some supplies at the site had been stolen. They would never catch them, these Upper Hivers. They thought wrong. They expected the thieves to be making their way back to a ship or to the holdings of a rivaling noble house. If the plan was going as intended, the components were at the very moment being encased in soft foam containers and dropped down the air intakes of the fungal mulchers at the bottom of the hive. It would take the men and women involved much longer to trickle back down to the underhive, but the loot would have been transported to a secure storage unit, completely unknown to them, by the time any of them so much as thought to cooperate with any Arbites forces. The plan went perfectly. Just like mold spreading over a rotting corpse in a field, so would the magpies spread their control all over the planet. Maybe even their whole system. The still open Vox Channel 79 started again. It had been silent for what felt like hours now. This time the incoming message was not preceded by the telltale static of an outgoing message from the planet. So, they hadn't been called.
For your civilians, we will send 2 companies of Gevesa. Human troops under our banner, our allies. It is against my best judgment, but the human soldiers will not be convinced to stand by. Many of them are from the world you know as Nidus Primus, a former imperial world that fell to Tyranid invasion. We provided aid then, and we will provide aid now. We are not the enemies of humanity. They will land as close to the crash site as operational doctrines permit, and they will engage anything material that pulls itself from the crash site, giving you time to evacuate. We once more request that you allow us to send battlesuit units and that you evacuate the civilians. I will overrule my field commanders after 2 hours of deployment around the crash site to minimize contamination of my troops. We will not have casualties like those of the 4th Sphere expansion again. Do not use planetary defenses on the piece of Space Hulk falling on the planet. It will only spread the corruption over a larger area. Supreme Commander Oshasera, out.
This time there wasn't an outgoing signal at all. The governor didn't denigrate himself or his office by listening to these vile Xenos. Good. Whatever moon or planet the fragment of ship that hunk of metal fell on would be damaged, but it was not worth selling their souls to these Xenos. Even if the fragment of Space Hulk was headed for Aviary Quintus, they would endure. The Upper Hivers might get radiation burns, but the Underhivers would persevere. Like cockroaches, they would feast on the decaying remnant of the Upper Hive and endure the fate of the elite. The magpies would thrive. The Underhive always proliferated during chaos. Hours passed. Curiosity itched at the back of the spider's mind, like the itch of a maggot, writhing under her still living skin. It could not be ignored. What settlement would be the happy hosts of these fragments of Space Hulk? Where would he be entombed forever in a gravity well, never to see the stars again? The comm panel lit up again, a myriad of blinking lights, like a glowing swarm of luminescent insects with a mind of its own. There were no horrified system-wide broadcasts, so nobody had been visited by the hunk of metal yet. The spider looked into the residence of the governor of the aviary system. Here, on Aviary Quintus, on the upper levels of this very hive, 5 kilometers up from where he was sitting. The suit was empty, the bed unmade. Oh, some servant would be harshly disciplined for this. Click! He switched to another video feed. An empty corridor, no security by the door. The governor had grown so lax he was now an easy mark for anyone he had angered. And you do not get to be that kind of position without making a few enemies. The spider was giddy. Maybe he would get to see the governor taken out alive. As always, chaos would feed the Underhivers. They thrived on chaos. Click. He switched to another video feed, this one showing the orbital craft landing pad on top of the governor's lodgings. It was empty. No entry team had yet taken positions on the roof from a vital craft. Pity. Click. The steam room now. The vid feed was near useless, but the auscultator in the room had been very useful. The governor was a man who enjoyed conducting meetings in his steam room. The idea of a steam room repulsed him. The spider scratched at the dark rash on his left leg. The steam room was quiet now, though, and the steam was less than what it would be if the room was warming up for use. Where was the governor? No hint of him so far. Oh no. Suddenly a grim realization came over the spider. He had been blind, so blind! The lack of outgoing messages to the Xenos for the last few hours. Click! He switched back to the landing pad. It was still empty. Empty! The governor's personal shuttle should be there. If it wasn't, it meant the governor had left the planet hours ago. The coward! Scum! He didn't deserve the blessings of the grandfather. At this point, there was a shudder. It came from outside the spider's nest. The planetary defense batteries opened up, and like a flower blossoming, like a ripe cadaver bursting from within and releasing all the offal it contained, the errant piece of space hulk burst over Aviary Quintus. Less than an hour after, the smooth planetary craft made planetfall. They started loading refugees while engaging in heavy combat with crazed planetary defense who had obviously not heeded the warnings and listened to what the Hulk had to say. The spider couldn't understand why they were fighting. Why would anyone try to stop it? Death would come for all of them, the final destination. Every being on this universe would one day cease to be, so why not embrace it? Why not go without pain? He set to broadcasting the recordings of the Hulk to every picked viewer and outgoing Vox channel connected to his web. All would join in the understanding of the greatness of the grandfather soon.